Well, good morning. This gives a whole new meaning to small church. When our kids were young, we got involved in the Strawberry Festival. Now, basically, there are two kinds of floats in the Strawberry Festival. There are big family floats, and there are small individual family floats. We started out working with a large group of people, and we spend a lot of time designing those floats and back and forth discussions. Well, one of our early floats, the ladies all got together and headed to Memphis to buy the supplies for the float. And on the way down there, they completely changed the float design. And they came back from Memphis with supplies for a completely different float. On my way to church this morning, I suddenly realized that a key element of my Sunday school lesson was left out. Now, I'm not going to pull a float redesign on you, but I got to tell you, I've got to stick something in, and I hope I don't forget it. So with that little background, I'll say welcome to this Sunday school lesson from the First United Methodist Church in Humboldt. Now, as you know, the teachers for these series rotate in a prescribed order. T.O. Lashley, Alan Grant, yours truly, Ben Barnett, and Walter Scott. Now, this format has both good and bad aspects. As one of the teachers, not having to prepare a lesson every week is definitely a good thing. As a student, you may also view this rotation of teachers as a good thing. For example, we have proof today. You may know when I'll be teaching so you can stay home. Well, actually, the format does present a problem for me. I'm an engineer by inclination and by training. I approach most things in a linear fashion and let the facts and ideas build toward a conclusion. Therefore, when I teach Sunday school, I feel compelled to add some background information and material that may seem unrelated to the lesson. Now, I mentioned last time that Exodus was a complicated book composed by many voices from different places and times. Today, I will expand on that just a little. I also want to be fair and acknowledge my sources. Engineers do not independently rediscover the laws of physics, and Sunday school teachers likewise have a host of resources to draw upon. For me, most of my background material comes from the Interpreter's Bible. Now, the first books of the Old Testament are collectively known as the Pentateuch, meaning 5. Now, for some, Moses is considered to be the author. And in fact, if you look in most Bibles, before the publication of the New English Bible in 1970, you will find these first 5 books referred to as the first book of Moses for Genesis, the second book of Moses for Exodus, and so on and so on. But in my view, when you say author, it is not the same thing as saying Harper Lee is the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, the stories in the Old Testament certainly, and in the New Testament to some degree, existed as oral tradition for a very long time before they were ever written down. These different writers had their own sources and their own agenda. The Pentateuch is thought to be the redaction and compilation of 4 original source documents. Not going any further with that idea in that direction today. But I will ask this question. How do you view this information versus the idea that the Bible was literally inspired by God? Now, if this were a normal Sunday school lesson, I'd stop right here and we spend the rest of the morning talking about that question. But this is not a normal time. And I'll leave that discussion for another day. But perhaps you can talk about it among your own family later today. I'll add one other idea before moving on with the lesson. The men who wrote the Bible contended that God found them. And over the centuries, readers of the Word testify that God found them also. God speaks through the book. It is the voice of His self-revealing grace. And as the psalmist says in Psalm 119, verse 105, Thy word is a lamp unto thy feet. Now, we begin the lesson. But before I read the text, I want to remind you of something else. These lessons began on September the 6th with Exodus 16 through to 15 and continued on line by line, ending last week with verse 17 of chapter 20. Therefore, where do you think I'm going to start reading this morning? Chapter 21, verse 1. Well, that'd be wrong. This is not correct. Today's lesson is actually Exodus 24, 1 through 11. What happened to chapters 21, 22, and 23? Why did the authors of our study leave them out? Well, I don't know. Perhaps you should read them yourself and see if you can figure it out. I'll give you a little hint. You're going to find some strange stuff in those chapters. Exodus 24, 1 through 11, which will be our topic text for today, deals with the ratification of the covenant. It's not the whole story, and the conclusion will be read next week. Now, here's the part that I forgot all about talking about. Nowhere in the lesson do I tell you what a covenant is, even suggest what a covenant is. Now, in all fairness, the authors of our literature didn't do that either, but I should have thought of it. A covenant is a contract. It involves two entities. It's sort of like a legal document. Perhaps like you go to the bank to borrow money, they give you the money, and you agree to give the money back plus some interest. So there's give and take and gain to be had on both sides. So what we're talking about this morning is the covenant relationship between God and this wandering nomadic people that we came to know as the Hebrew and the Israelites. And this morning, we're going to look at two ceremonies that is recorded in these verses in Exodus, ratifying that covenant. So I read Exodus 24, verses 1 through 11. I read from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship at a distance. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the law. And he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in a basin, and half of the blood he dashed against the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, see, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And God did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. And also they beheld God, and they ate and they drank. And that ends the reading of our lesson. Now, we'll try to delve into it a little bit and see if we can figure out what they said. There are two ceremonies in this lesson, and they're not in order. It begins in verse 1 and 2, where Moses leads a group of men up the mountain. Now, in verse 3, they're back down from the mountain, and the second ceremony begins. Moses reads the words of the law to the people, and they promise to obey all of them. And Moses then builds an altar. Now, when I was reviewing where I was going to be standing this morning giving this lesson, it occurs to me that there has been a major evolution in symbolism in this very space within my lifetime. This sanctuary was built in 1899. The stage was arranged much like it is today. Now, the back behind us here was open. Organ was not here. Choir rail was not here. Pulpit was in the center. Altar was down below it. And the communion rail was a closed ark. And the pulpit being in the center indicated supremacy of the word. Now, this furniture that you see today was not original. The first pulpit was kind of small and not very stable. The top was actually larger than the bottom. Now, I know this because we still have that pulpit. And I actually repurposed it into a wall decoration when we renovated the Elizabeth Lacey classroom some years ago. But that original pulpit, because of its design, was bolted to the floor. And the pulpit was above the altar and above the communion rail. Now, over time, theology evolved, and Methodism began to see that perhaps the communion rail being closed and continuous did not properly convey the idea of God being accessible to the people. So new churches began to design their rails differently. Older churches like this one considered how to fix it. And the way they fixed it was to cut a hole in it. This was done in the late 60s. But we kept the piece that we cut out just in case. Years ago, our preacher Alan Grant suggested that we move the pulpit to the side, bring the altar from lower, place it in the center where it becomes the centerpiece of our worship stage, just like the altar was the centerpiece in our story in Exodus today. Now, the altar in Exodus was probably just a pile of dirt, maybe a rough stone, but most likely just a pile of dirt, but an elevated space. Now, 12 pillars were erected. Now, what that means is basically they put up a stone column, or perhaps they just piled a few stones up in 12 different places. These were nomadic people. They were not master builders. Oxen were then sacrificed on the altar, and the blood was collected. Now, ancient people did not have a scientific understanding of biology, and they did know, though, that blood was important. And if you lost enough of it, you would die. And they also believed that blood had magical properties. And this is not surprising. Remember the story of the Passover in Egypt when they marked the doorpost with blood so the angel of death would not enter the house? I want us to note also the animal chosen for the sacrifice. Oxen were very important animals. We know from ancient Egyptian artifacts and hieroglyphics that oxen and cattle were important sources of food, clothing, and objects of worship. The wandering tribes of Israelites were in bondage in Egypt, so it's easy to imagine that they would have brought oxen and other cattle with them when they left. I think the lesson here is that gifts to God should be significant. Now, you may hear that again today because I happen to know what Alan will be preaching about. The blood is dispersed. Half of it is thrown on the altar, but half of it is thrown on the people. And this ceremony closes with these words: "See the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you." Covenant is a two-way relationship involving commitments by two different entities. In this case, it is the people of Israel, and it is their God, which they call Yahweh. They're going to do things for him by obeying his commandments. He's going to do things for them. But that's part of the rest of the story. Now, verse 9 through 11 conclude our lesson, and we immediately find a big problem if we take the Bible literally. Verse 10 says, "They saw the face of God." Now, there are many places in the Bible, actually, state that if you look directly at God's face, you will die. Now, the author tries to work around that a little bit by indicating that, well, maybe they didn't really see God's face. All they really saw was God's feet walking on this sparkly looking road. But whatever, they survive and they eat. They have a meal. These 70 men and the 4 named men. Did God partake of the meal? No mention of that in Scripture. But they celebrated the covenant by eating a common meal together. You'll see this again in the New Testament. And that is the end of the lesson. Thank you, and stay safe.